welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to completely transform how you look at and use one of the most foundational elements of academic writing, the reporting verb. We're going to really zoom in on those split-second choices you make when bringing outside sources into your work. And honestly, by the end of this, you are literally never going to look at a sentence the same way again. Okay, let's dive into this. Just think about two completely identical findings. In one version, you write, Chen 2023 proves that, and in the other, Chen 2023 claims that. We're talking about the exact same source here, right? But they send your reader two radically different messages. That is the hidden superpower of the reporting verb. It's absolutely not just some grammatical decoration to hold your sentence together. Every single time you pick one of these verbs, you're making a deliberate judgment. And whether you realize it or not, your reader hears that judgment loud and clear. So here is the absolutely crucial point we have to establish. There is no such thing as a neutral reporting verb. They just don't exist. You know, you might think that reaching for plain vanilla verbs like reports or states or finds kind of gets you off the hook. But no, even those seemingly flat verbs carry a very specific stance. They aren't just stylistic synonyms, they are active judgments. So the question you should be asking yourself isn't, well, which verb sounds the most academic here? Instead, the question you actually need to ask is, what am I telling my reader I think about this source? You are literally guiding their interpretation through that single verb choice. To pull that off effectively, we need a solid framework. So the very first question in our decision tree is this. Is this source giving us factual findings or theoretical ideas? Like, are we looking at cold, hard results, evidence, and data? Or are we looking at a position, maybe an interpretation or an argument? How you categorize the source material right here in this very first step is going to dictate the entire path of your verb choice. Section 1, Reporting Findings, the 3 levels of evidence. To make this incredibly clear, let's just put a constant variable up on the whiteboard. Peer feedback improves draft quality. As we move through these next few concepts, we are going to keep this exact finding completely identical. The finding itself won't change at all. The only thing we're going to tweak is the evidence behind it. And I want you to watch how our verb literally has to adapt. See, when you're reporting a finding, your verb tells the reader exactly how strong you judge the underlying evidence to be. Think of it as a 3-step scale. First up, we have tentative evidence. This is maybe just a handful of studies with, really small sample sizes. Then we step up to sufficient evidence. This could be a considerable cluster of studies or maybe just one really solid study with a massive sample and bulletproof methods. And finally, at the very top, we have definitive evidence. These are your stacked systematic reviews, meta-analyses, basically the absolute heavy hitters. Let's see how our verbs actually map to this scale. Okay, so if the evidence is tentative, again, just a few small studies, we need our language to reflect that natural caution. You'll want to reach for verbs like suggests, indicates, or implies. So our constant finding becomes, research suggests that peer feedback improves draft quality. You aren't fully committing here, mostly because the evidence itself just doesn't allow you to. It's totally accurate to the reality of the data. But what happens when we step up to sufficient evidence? Because we've got a solid, large study, or maybe a good chunk of them, we can comfortably upgrade to stronger, more grounded verbs. We're stepping up to words like reports, finds, or observes. So now our sentence shifts. Chen finds that peer feedback improves draft quality. It just feels a lot more concrete, doesn't it? It's a direct observation backed by sufficient data. And this brilliantly illustrates the top of our scale, definitive evidence. When you're sitting on a meta-analysis of 40 different studies, you need to match that unshakable authority with powerhouse verbs, things like demonstrates, shows, or establishes. A meta-analysis demonstrates that peer feedback improves draft quality. Notice how, throughout all of these examples, the actual finding never changed. What changed was the quality of the evidence behind it. Your chosen verb did all the heavy lifting, reporting your expert judgment of that evidence right to the reader. Section 2. Reporting ideas, signaling stance. Now, if the source is presenting an idea rather than hard data, there are 2 primary things your verb can signal. The first is your personal stance as the writer toward that idea. Let's look at endorsement, for instance. Nguyen argues that rubrics constrain creativity. By choosing argues, you're quietly signaling to the reader that you find Nguyen's idea to be pretty well reasoned. But compare that to distancing yourself. Nguyen claims that rubrics constrain creativity. Bam! By dropping in claims, you are deliberately holding that idea at arm's length. You're basically whispering to your reader, hey, I'm not totally convinced by this. Let's actually build out your toolkit for this right now. If you want to endorse a source's idea, you should add these verbs to your arsenal: argues, contends, and maintains. But if you need to distance yourself and maybe show a little skepticism, you're going to lean on verbs like claims, asserts, or assumes. Seriously, jot these down, because intentionally swapping an argues for a claims will instantly shift the entire tone of your paragraph. It's a real game changer. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the second thing an idea reporting verb can signal. It's not just about your stance, it's about revealing the source's own stance toward their idea. Like, how are they treating this point within their own argument? We might see a source insisting on something. Lee insists the effect holds across contexts. Or, alternatively, we might see a source conceding a point. Lee acknowledges that the sample was small. When a source commits firmly to a position, especially if they're pushing back against some opposition, you really want to capture that energy. You do that with verbs like insists, emphasizes, or stresses. But on the flip side, when a source is granting a point, perhaps a little reluctantly, or just to show academic honesty about their own limitations, you'd use verbs like acknowledges, concede, or admit. In this case, you're basically acting as a highly precise translator of the original author's attitude. Wrap up: the decision path. Let's move to and see how this builds systematically. Before you write any reporting verb, trace this mental path. Step 1, ask yourself, am I looking at findings or am I looking at ideas? Step 2, if it's findings, you need to judge the evidence. Is it tentative, sufficient, or definitive? Step 3, if it's ideas, ask yourself, whose attitude am I signaling here, mine or the source's? And if it's mine, am I endorsing this idea or distancing myself from it? By naturally following these descending decision branches, you ensure you're always choosing your words with absolute precision. Which brings us to our final thought. The overarching lesson here is that your reporting verb is doing your critical thinking out loud for the reader. It is the visible, tangible evidence of your analysis. So I want to leave you with this question to ask yourself the next time you review a draft you've written. What judgments are your verbs making right now? Are they actually saying what you mean to say? Take control of these verbs, and I promise you, you take control of your entire narrative. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.